Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our project talk section of this of the Americas region. And in this section, we have 4 different projects that's being carried out by the Fresh Eyes on CMIP project groups. And the first one is the CMIP data use statistics, which will be presented by Juliette Lavoie. Juliette.
So, hi everyone. I'll be presenting our project on data usage of CMIP6. I'd like to acknowledge also everyone on the team, especially Elisa, who's also co-leading this project with me. And so CMIP6 has lot of data. There was 16 petabytes of data produced for CMIP6, and it's really used around the world by a bunch of different types of users. And there are also multiple places where you can download CMIP6 data. Let's dig a little bit into those sources. And so the main place is, of course, ESGF, so the nodes where the modelers are uploading their data, and you can go through Metagrid and download from there. But there are also other sources. So Pangeo created a subset that has been put on the cloud. So there's an Amazon bucket, there's a Google bucket. There is also some data that can be downloaded through Copernicus, where you can subset some of the data already. So that can be useful for a bunch of different users that maybe don't have the space to download huge amount of data. When we try to understand the usage of CMIP6 data, we also need to take into account the copies that are on institutional servers, which would have been downloaded once from the ESGF, but people might be using it multiple times and multiple people might be using it. So we have to keep in mind that we won't be able to know the usage from those copies. And another thing that we won't be able to take into considerations, but is part of usage, is all the downstream data sets that have been created by CMIP6. So there's the dynamically downscaled data, mostly in the Cordex project, but also statistically downscaled data are used a lot for decision making and policy. And there's no space right now where we have a list of all of these data sets. So for the project, for the part 1 of the project, they're kind of put on hold, but let's keep in mind that these also exist. So the goal of the project is really to develop a report that analyzes global pattern of usage of CMIP6 data. The first thing we start from is really the ESGF data, because the CMCC has created this dashboard that compiles all of the statistic from the download. So they look at the number of files, but also the size of the downloads from many of the nodes. Not all of the nodes are watched by this dashboard, but enough that it can give us a good idea. So I'll show you some of the initial figures we've been working on. Just as a warning, this is a work in progress, draft figures. This is not finished work. But just to let you know a little bit what we're working on. The first step was really to clean the data. So in CMIP6 control vocabulary, there are 43 accepted tables. So that's the realm and the frequency of the data, and about 2,000 accepted individual variables that have the table plus the base variable. So let's say temperature in the atmosphere monthly. But a lot of the data that we had to work with was not valid, like the temperature of the ocean in the atmosphere, or the temperature of the atmosphere AMOD, but at frequency daily. So we had to remove all of these files, and we saw that about 1,000 terabytes of data had been downloaded by users that was just basically wrong, didn't really make sense. Hopefully the users were able to figure it out, but Ideally, in CMIP 7, these types of issues will be able to be squashed. There's a QA/QC project that could verify these easy stuff before the data are updated so that nobody downloads wrong data. So one thing that we can look at is the top variables, most used variables. But then we run into a problem where it depends on the metric that we're using, because we can see by total size versus number of downloads, we don't have the same usage. So there are a lot of things that will interfere with pure usage. So dimensionality, if this is 3D data, grids, if it's atmosphere, ocean, the number of levels, availability, if a lot of data is available, then more will have been used, obviously. And then frequency, we can see here in the 6 hours levels, there are very low number of files, but very high total memory because, well, there's a lot of time steps, so a really big file. So one metric that we look at is the total size of download divided by the total size of upload to try to adjust for all of those factors. And here we're looking at the distribution of the different variables for this R. And so if we are below 1, that means that it's been downloaded less than there has been uploads. So that's not ideal, and there are about 200 variables that are under 1, but in general the average is more around 21, so it's being used a lot. And we have also those superstar variables that have been downloaded like a lot. Another type of thing we look at is downloads per model, and then we can see also strange things where ECR seems to be extremely popular, and it's not necessarily because everybody just loves that model, but ECR just uploads a large amount of file, like they upload 1 file per year instead of 1 file for the whole time series, so that will also play. So that's another thing that we have to like take into consideration when we look at usage. We look also at experiments and how the experiments in different MIPs are distributed. And we have a lot of people in our group that are with certain MIPs and are interested in seeing the popularity of different experiments. And so that was kind of the initial stuff we looked at for ESGF, but we also want to look at other sources. And this is now an open call to the community. If you have access to statistics of data from other sources, we'd be really interested in talking with you. You can email me here because we've been having trouble getting that data, basically. So in the meantime, we've just looked at the availability on Google, on Amazon, on Copernicus of the different variables compared to their popularity on ESGF. So here we have the top 10 variable on ESGF and the bottom 10. And in green, if they're available, and in red, they're not available. So here you see that a lot of the top variables in ESGF are not available on Copernicus, while Google has some really unpopular data there. If we kind of fill in the blank and look at all the variables, it looks a little bit something like this. So ideally, what we would want is a lot of green at the top and a lot of red at the bottom if we wanted to be the most efficient with our data storage. And so the next step for the project is to look at more complete data with CMCC. Right now, we've only been able to look at data that is public, but we're in contact with CMCC and we're trying to get more of their data that is more intricate, where we can see variables inside of experiment, for example. But it's a bit tricky right now because they're updating their servers, so hopefully we can do that soon. We also want to look at data from citations, geography data. We want to continue to disentangle these usage from other patterns in the data, expand to other sources. And I think this project has been a lot of challenges and caveats, so we're going to document all that in the report also, so maybe in the future it will be an exercise that will be easier to do. And yes, finally complete the report. And so I want to say thank you to Paul and Map that are the co-lead from the WIP that helped us. Also, all the people from CMCC, which helped us with their dashboard. This project used to be the project of the infrastructure task team. So I want to thank all the past member of that task team and also all the present member of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliette. I guess let's see if there's any questions for Juliette. And I think also I want to ask you, are you open to receive more people who want to contribute to this project who are on this call right now?
Well, if somebody is highly motivated to join, sure, we've already started, so maybe there's going to be a bit of catching up to do, but especially if you have experience playing with that type of data or you have access to other sources, then we would be totally open to talking with you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Any other questions for Juliette? If not, we will move on to our next presentation by Brodie Pearson on the model bias. Brodie, are you there? I saw Brodie earlier.
Doesn't look like he's currently online.
Huh. I saw him earlier. Maybe he has to switch drop. Maybe we can move on to next presentation first and then come back to Brodie when he rejoins us.
Looks like he's just rejoined, potentially.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Sorry about
that.
Hey,
Brodie. No worries.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Good. Yeah, sorry, I went to share my screen and realized my system settings needed me to restart.
Okay.
Okay.
No worries. No, yeah, you can share your screen now.
Cool. Okay, does this look good, your end?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for letting me talk today in the project section. I'm going to be talking about the Fresh Eyes on CMIP bias project. I'm thankful for Yuan gave a talk in the Asia time zone session of this, and I'm giving this talk in the Americas session. But I also wanted to acknowledge the co-leads for the project who've been really helpful with putting these slides together and driving this project forward. So Sabine, Pauline, Andre, and Flossie. And this project's full name is actually Identifying and Communicating Model Biases. So there's an age-old adage that no model is perfect, but all models are useful. And so part of our project's goal is to figure out in what ways are the CMIP models that we use imperfect, and how do we communicate those imperfections and quantify them and kind of prioritize them so the community is aware of those, so they know how to get the most utility out of the models as they work with them. So the structure of how I'm going to talk about this is I'm first going to go over the project goals, so the anticipated projects and the scope of the project, some of the prior Fresh Eyes on CMIP work that's set us up for success on this project. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing now, so the kinds of model biases that we are trying to investigate and review. And I'll go through an example using ocean heat content of how the review of these biases is not as simple as it might seem at first. And then I'll talk about some future plans, and particularly how you can help if you're interested in engaging with us through this bias project. So to start off with the goals, like the name suggests, identifying and communicating are our primary goals. When we're talking about identification, we're talking about identifying the priority model biases, so which are most important from the community's perspective and from the climate impacts perspective. How do we group those? We'll talk about grouping them into Earth system components and or domains of the Earth system when I come to talk about the variables themselves. And then identifying what the impacts of those are. So that feeds into their priority status. But it's also important for people trying to understand how they might utilize data, where might biases be having the largest impact, if they're trying to look at something that's strongly impacted by certain biases, for example. We're interested in identifying the sources of those biases. So this helps with planning solutions for how to reduce those biases. And then bias communication methods. So some biases some biases in models are contrasted using raw CMIP variables, kind of global means of properties. Some are contrasted using indexes or indicators or modes, which are derived variables from those data. And then also communicating kind of which are the most important and urgent aspects of these biases to try and be addressing in future scientific endeavors, like which ones are most important to try and reduce or account for. And then communicating this information to the scientific community. So all those pieces in the earlier section is our end goal. And on that front, with this project intended to be 18 months long, we have about 12 months left, I think, of that. And the products that we want at the end of this project are a review paper on model biases, covering the biases that I'm about to talk about, the community priority biases, potentially feeding into the rapid evaluation framework and CMIP's thinking about these biases, what is important for the community, making recommendations on that front, and then disseminating through presentations like this one. So communicating how the things that we're finding out about model biases. And I mentioned that we're leveraging some prior Fresh Eyes work. This project largely evolved from an earlier subgroup on model benchmarking, the Fresh Eyes and CMIP model benchmarking subgroup, and lots of our co-leads from that subgroup transitioned across to the co-leads for this project. But we're also, and there were some outputs from that project that were community-based surveys, but we're also utilizing another Fresh Eyes survey that was led by Flossie Brown and Aditya, which was analyzing, surveying the community on what their priority diagnostics and analysis methods were. And that's informed a lot of what I'm going to talk about in a second, which is the variables, the biases that we're focusing on, which were identified as community priority biases from these surveys. The group itself has our project group has a variety of community members spanning all Earth system science domains. So we have, and this survey encompassed that group as well. I'm going to talk about those Earth system domains in a second. And the survey ranked the diagnostics and analysis methods and gave people an opportunity to point out some missing diagnostics. And from all that information that we got from this survey, we constructed a list of 28 high priority model biases. Members of the subgroup of the project are or subgroups of members of the project looking at each of these biases, and we've broadly categorized the 28 model biases into each of the domains of the Earth system. So from an oceans and sea ice perspective, we're looking at things like sea ice anomaly, large-scale ocean circulation, and properties like sea surface temperature, like ocean heat content. From a land and land ice perspective, we're looking at soil and leaf properties, gross primary productivity, runoff, snow. So that's spanning quite a wide range of different land and land ice systems. From an atmosphere perspective, annual cycles of key variables, energy fluxes, so heat, momentum fluxes, climate modes and evaporation, precipitation, cloud radiative feedback, and intertropical convergence zone biases that we've identified there as being important to the community and the climate system. Earth system, when we're thinking about the coupled Earth system, things like climate sensitivity and climate responses, and the historical climate change, the ability of models to simulate that are all high priority things. And then we also have some impacts and adaptation things. So things like large amplitude Rossby waves, which affect the environment experienced by a lot of people at mid latitudes, precipitation and temperature variability, and climate drivers for fire. And in addition to identifying these, we're now that these have been identified, we're trying to review the literature on each. Even though each of these is one bias or can be categorized as one bias, it's not always as easy to review as simply looking at one property and one specific value of a bias. And so I wanted to talk about that from the perspective of ocean heat content for a second, because I'm a physical oceanographer, so this is a bit more in my domain. So ocean heat content is important because changes in ocean heat content reflect how much heat the ocean has absorbed or lost to the atmosphere and the rest of the Earth system. And so it represents the ocean's contribution to buffering the Earth system and its temperature changes. And so this plot on the right is a study from Khosravi et al. 2022, looking at the biases in the Arctic Ocean. The blue line here is the multimodal mean of CMIP 6. The green and black lines are observations of the temperature profile as a function of depth in the ocean. And one of the things that's pretty clear here is that there's a warm bias. There's also a fresh bias at depth, where the CMIP models overestimate the temperature of the ocean deep in the water column. And this is really important because the Arctic is somewhere where ice-ocean interactions are very dependent on the fate of ice in the Arctic, which has its own very important climate impacts, is very sensitive to the properties of the ocean, particularly its temperature in this region. So that's one study focusing on a specific region and contrasting the bias in heat content below the ocean surface. But like I said, ocean heat content is one category of bias, but the bias that you see isn't necessarily the same if you look at it from different perspectives. So this is a regional kind of analysis of the temperature or heat content itself, showing that the Arctic is warmer in CMIP 6 models than in observations. But if you look at a global scale, like the study from Sohail I mentioned at the bottom, they actually find that there's a cooling ocean heat content bias over the recent historical period. So that cooling bias is a little bit different from the warming bias seen in the Arctic, or the warm bias seen in the Arctic, because we're looking at the global scale rather than the regional scale, but also we're talking about trends in ocean heat content now. So in the Arctic, the ocean is warmer in CMIP than it is in observations, but this global study is saying that the rate of warming globally is slower than the rate of warming observed in CMIP 6 is slower than the rate of warming observed in derived from observation. So we're talking about rates of ocean heat content change versus raw values of ocean heat content, and regional versus global. And so these biases, even though they can get grouped under one heading, can actually have lots of different facets to these biases that we're looking at. And so one of the interesting things from this study is that they source the origin of that error in the cooling ocean heat content bias in CMIP 6 to be caused by inaccurate sea surface temperature and heat fluxes in the warmest regions, and that's caused by bias mixing. So it provides a pathway to focusing on model development that can improve the ability of these CMIP 6 models to simulate ocean heat content changes over time through improving upper ocean mixing parameterizations. And so that's just a taste of one of the variables that we're looking at. We have several people looking at each of those variables that I talked about on the previous page, and the aim is to synthesize those into a paper that we can submit that reviews these biases and their different impacts, their different features, or the different biases and their commonalities as well. We're aiming to support the REF if we can through there. And then the place where it could be really useful to glean your help if you're interested in these bias-related issues is that we're looking for domain-specific expertise. There are some biases which our current project team, even though we have almost, I believe, 25 to 30 people in this project team, there are still some gaps in our expertise. And so we don't have people who have that expertise to analyze some of the community priority variables like snow cover, correlations between cloud relevant variables. So they were looking for people who have expertise with cloud modeling, cloud biases, and cloud feedbacks, and then internal variability of precipitation and surface temperature. But even if you're not interested or experienced in those three topics, if there were biases that I showed on a couple of slides ago that you're interested in working with us to assess, review, and communicate, then we welcome you contacting us. Our project team co-leads are all our emails are all available through the Fresh Eyes project interface, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening to this talk.
Thank you, Brodie. You're expecting my question about how people can participate or contribute. So let's see if there's other people who have questions for Brodie for the model bias project. James, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Brodie. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I come to bias a lot from the perspective of producing data sets that we can work with a variety of customers and users. And the big thing therefore comes in is bias correction and sort of correcting the biases in the models towards observational data sets. I was just wondering if there was any thinking around that sort of perspective, or how that, the role of that in your work. That was the question. There's a comment as well that obviously I think lots of what you're doing needs to feed into our entry-level documentation project. So that's the plug at the other end.
Yeah, I agree that there's a lot of interconnectedness and synergy that can be leveraged across these projects. And to address your question, maybe I'm interpreting this right. So I think our perspective is looking at biases and identifying ways to reduce those biases through targeted model development. I think that's kind of some of the stuff that we're proposing. Are you talking more about the reduction of biases if you have data sets, post-processing reduction of biases, if the sources are known? So I don't think we've really discussed that very much, but it would be an interesting thing to perhaps accumulate within our reviews is methods for accounting for those biases then known once kind of they're quantified.
Thank you, Brodie, and thanks, James. And I think now it's time for us to move on to our next presentation. But if you still have questions for the project, please put them in the Padlet, and so we can follow up. Also, James, if you don't mind, put your hands down, so I won't be calling you again next one. Next presentation will be on data request. It will be presented by Robert Fajber. Robert, are you online?
Yep. Let me just see if I can share this. Perfect. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I can't see anyone, so just let me know if there's a question I need to stop talking. But yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and talking with everyone. I'm going to talk about the CMIP 7 data request and specifically what the Fresh Eyes group is trying to do to support the data request. So to start off, why do we need data request? So these are some slides that Timothy Lamb put together. And the idea is, as CMIP 7 is under construction, we're trying to make all these different decisions about how data is actually going to be developed and then used by different people. And so on one hand, you have these groups, the MIPS, the Model and Comparison Projects, and all these different communities who typically come together with either an applied question or kind of a fundamental research question that they'd like to be able to answer. And then on the other hand, you have the modeling centers who are actually developing these large Earth system models. And of course, obviously, there's people at the modeling centers who have their own scientific questions they'd like to have answered. But quite often, there's a big separation between these two different groups, right? So there's MIPS and communities who have these questions they want to get answered. And then there's the modeling centers who are trying to figure out what their model can do and what they can produce. And sometimes it's difficult to get these two groups to talk to each other, which is important because whatever data ends up being archived by these modeling centers in the end, we need to make sure it's actually useful. And that's basically where data request comes in. And so the whole idea of the data request task team is trying to sort of synchronize between these two different groups. So on one hand, talking to the modeling centers and figuring out what data they're actually going to be producing and sharing and archiving, and then talking to different MIPS and communities and trying to figure out what data they need to answer their questions. And ideally, we want these two things to go together so that the data that actually gets produced by the modeling centers is going to be useful for the most number of people. And probably a lot of people are familiar with how this worked in CMIP 6, but I'll just kind of briefly review. So in CMIP 6, the way data request worked is that it was very much a variable-driven idea. So you can kind of see here, this is a big flowchart that describes all the different parts of how a variable got created in CMIP. But there's this section here, the CMOR variable. If you've used CMIP data, you're probably familiar with these CMOR variables. It's kind of like a standard way of talking about variables in CMIP. And then, these come with the CF standard name and the MIPS. But the point is, in CMIP 6, it was very variable-driven. So everybody agreed and said, these are the variables that we want to be produced. However, there's a big problem with that in that, okay, you might have a variable like, say, surface temperature. But just knowing that you're going to produce surface temperature doesn't tell you what experiments you would want to produce surface temperature for. It doesn't tell you what frequency you might want to save surface temperature. Do you want to save daily surface temperature? Do you want to save monthly surface temperature? Do you want to save the daily maximum surface temperature? So just knowing the variable wasn't really enough to make sure that the data was going to be useful for everyone. So in CMIP 7, we've tried to transition into a different model. So instead of having a variable-focused model, we have what's called an opportunity-focused model up here at the top. And I'll get more into this, but the whole idea with opportunities is that it's trying to pull together all these different things. So it's trying to pull in not just information about the variables, but also the experiments and the modeling groups as well, to pull it together into kind of a useful collection of information. So to get more into it, this is kind of a diagram that explains how data request works in CMIP 7. So the idea is you have these variable groups, and I'll explain these a little bit later and show you some examples. But you can kind of think of variable groups as kind of like variables or kind of variables that you'd expect to use together, right? So you might expect there's like a cloud variable group that has different kind of cloud variables, which would be useful for somebody assessing cloudiness. Or you might expect there's like a land processes group, which has a bunch of different variables related to processes happening over the land surface. And so these are kind of like light groups of variables that get stuck together. The second part of the data request opportunity is experiments. So these are typical groups of experiments. So some of these, if you've used CMIP data before, you're probably familiar with. So we have things like historical, different future scenarios. There's also experiment groups that have more elaborate scenarios. So some experiments where you might increase sea surface temperatures outside the Arctic, and then separately decrease sea ice inside the Arctic. So this would be what was called the polar amplification MIP experiments in the last CMIP. So there's lots of different experiments groups sort of coming from very typical things to sort of more outlandish things. But these are all together in groups. And the idea of having a data request opportunity is that you pull together a bunch of variables that you would need to calculate whatever it is you're interested in, together with a set of experiments that are going to let you probe whatever question you want to probe. And so by combining these things, the experiment groups and the variable groups together into one opportunity, we can kind of ensure that the data that's being produced by CMIP 7 is going to be useful for a lot of different users to actually be able to answer their questions. Okay, so that was kind of a lot of high-level stuff, but let me kind of go into and show you some examples. So I should say, currently we have this thing called an Airtable. I've got a link, I think, in the next slide or two. I'll also post in the chat. So you can take a look at the Airtable, and all this stuff is available. All the screenshots I'm showing are just screenshots of the Airtable. But these are some of the opportunities that exist. And you can see some of them are very straightforward, like atmospheric dynamics and variability. This is kind of, as an atmospheric dynamicist, this is kind of my standard bread and butter. And you get things that are sort of more applied. Like, there's an opportunity surrounding agricultural and food system impacts. And there's many more than I put in the screenshot here. This was just as many as I could fit on the slide. But there's all these different opportunities that exist that, again, are trying to combine these different variables and experiments together. So to take a look at one, this is just an example opportunity I pulled up. This one's called Robust Risk Assessment of Tipping Points. So this was an opportunity basically to try to understand, is the climate system going to undergo some kind of irreversible tipping point in the future? So worrying about things like AMOC collapse or rapid deforestation of the Amazon. And so you can see here, it's associated with a couple different model and comparison projects. So these are different communities of people who are trying to answer different questions. So, the tipping point model and comparison project obviously is the one most associated with this. But then you can see there's a bunch of different variable groups associated with this. So the TipMIP baseline and the TipMIP extended. And the reason that we have these different variable groups, you might say, well, why isn't there just one variable group if it's all part of TipMIP? And the reason is that they have these different priority levels. So the first one, the baseline, these are the high priority variables. So these are the ones that we would really ask that every modeling center produce if they're going to be part of TipMIP. But the TipMIP extended, these are ones which are more sort of optional. So these are things that would be nice to have, but are not considered as essential as the baseline variables. And you can see that these variable groups are then paired together with a series of experimental groups. And again, the goal of this is to make sure that we have the right diagnostics coupled with the right experiments in order to actually be able to answer questions. And so just to pull up one of these variable groups and kind of show you what it looks like, this is the one for TipMIP baseline. Again, you can see the priority level here is high. There's a lot more variables than the ones that I put in here, but I just put the first couple that were on the page. And so you can see that it gives not only the frequency of output we want, so the AMON here stands for atmospheric monthly, as well as the variable. So again, the idea is we're trying to contain not just information about specific variables we want, but specific variables at specific frequencies inside the same variable group. Okay, so that model that I just described works well if there's an opportunity that already aligns with what you wanted to do. But let's say you had a question and it didn't fit well within one of these opportunities. So this is a sort of a second way of approaching the problem that kind of shows how you could still use the variable groups and the opportunities to try to answer a question. So just as an example, let's say we wanted to calculate the fire weather index. So this is basically an index that tells you how likely wildfires are to start. The exact details don't matter too much, but we're going to need a bunch of input variables. And one of the most important ones is the 2-meter daily maximum temperature. And so imagine that you were staring at just tons and tons of CMIP7 data, and you wanted to very quickly find out which experiments and models have this data, so you can start to formulate not just how you're going to calculate the fire weather index, but what questions you're going to be able to ask using the CMIP7 data. So this is kind of going through the problem in reverse of what we just did. And so what you can do is you can search through the air tables by variable. So what I've done here is I've just searched for a variable day.tsmax, which is the daily maximum surface temperature. And you can see that this daily maximum surface temperature is in a whole bunch of these different variable groups. So it's part of the baseline daily. It's also part of things like biodiversity land daily, the CFMIP daily. So this day TS max is in a whole bunch of different groups. And if we just go into the baseline daily, we can see what other variables there are. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of other variables, some related to surface humidity, that's the HUSS, daily precipitation, etc. And it turns out that all the different variables you would need to compute the fire weather index are actually sitting inside this baseline daily variable group. And so why this is useful is that now you could go back to the air table and see which opportunities include this baseline daily group. And by seeing which opportunities include this baseline daily group, this will basically give you a list of all the different models and experiments that are producing the data you need in order to calculate whatever quantity you're interested in. And so by kind of approaching it this way in terms of these group variables, it gives you a very quick way to kind of figure out what models and experiments are going to have the data that you need to do your calculations. And so kind of just to summarize what I started with, you kind of imagine a couple different example workflows. So the first thing is if you want to calculate something, if you can find an opportunity that has everything that you need, then that's great, because you're just going to be able to filter all the data by that opportunity and very quickly find out which models and experiments are going to be available and make sure that you can answer your questions. Otherwise, if it's not aligned with an opportunity, then you can do the process that I just showed, where you kind of pick a variable that you're interested in, and then you can search for the related variable groups, MIPS, and opportunities. And the hope is that by having these variable groups and opportunities, this data discovery process is going to be a lot simpler than in CMIP 6, where you had to go through and search for your data amongst a whole bunch of different experiments. And again, we're hoping that overall the groupings adopted in CMIP 7 are going to make this process a lot easier. And again, I'll post this link in the chat after I'm done the presentation. But if you're interested in how this all works, I'd highly recommend looking at the Airtables. I could sit here and talk to you for another hour about how this all works, but honestly, it would be way less useful than if you just spend 5 minutes searching through it yourself. You'll pick it up very quickly. So just to explain where we are very briefly, so data request was one of sort of the first things that started as part of CMIP 7, because obviously it's really important to figure out what outputs need to be produced before the models begin to run. And so there's a whole process. I won't go through all the different phases, but I will just say a big part of this was consultation with the community. So data request isn't just a bunch of people sitting by themselves making decisions. Data request involves large consultations with different communities, especially different scientific communities looking to answer questions, but also the modeling development groups themselves. And then so it's kind of leading up to a set of papers which are currently in the review stages, looking to be submitted very soon if they haven't already been. And so a lot of data request was basically involved in those papers, which are basically kind of setting out what these variable groups are, what the different opportunities look like, and basically creating kind of documentation surrounding all of that. But going forward, there's actually still a couple things that need to be done with data request. So one thing, and something that maybe we'll collaborate with the other groups on, is trying to create more documentation, especially for first-time users, to better understand how the Airtables work and better understand how all the different parts of the data discovery work. And then the other thing we've been talking about is there's going to be continued data requests that happen even after these papers come out, and something called the unharmonized data request. And so one of the other things our group is trying to figure out is how we can best support the unharmonized data request in the future. With that, I'd just like to really thank Timothy Lam, who is the co-chair on the data request group before me, and Fei Lu, who's currently the co-chair. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about the Fresh Eyes data request, you can just drop me an email and I will get in touch and we can put you into our group. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robert. And I see Timothy is also online and also put in the link to the Airtable. So thanks, Timothy. Right. Maybe we have time for one quick question for, yes, Juliette.
Hey, hi. I think this is going to be really cool to be able to look at the data and find what we need. But I have kind of two questions. Like, first of all, if we take again your example of fire weather data, and then you look at an opportunity that's kind of a bigger core thing, wouldn't, by looking at this opportunity, you might miss some of the models that like have all the data that you actually need, but not like all of the other ones that are in this like kind of larger group? And that kind of leads to a second one. Will this like opportunity, will this continue to be open and will more be able to be created like in time, or is this going to become a fixed thing like once CMIP 7 starts coming out?
Yeah, so I can answer your second question first, and Timothy, feel free to jump in if I make a mistake here. But there's basically two parts of data request. So there's a part that was called the harmonized part, which is basically trying to create sort of like a fixed set of opportunities that are going to be distributed to the modeling centers more or less now, or they're sort of in the process of being distributed. And the goal of the harmonized is kind of to provide kind of like a fixed set of variable groups and opportunities that everybody can use. After that, though, like I said, there's going to be the second phase of data request, which is going to be called the unharmonized phase. And in the unharmonized phase, yes, I mean, obviously there will still be people who, for whatever reason, were not part of the harmonized phase. I'm one of those people because at the time I didn't have a job, but that's how these things go. So there will still be people making requests. There will still be people trying to come up with new projects and stuff. And actually, that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out now, is figuring out how to kind of support the unharmonized request and make that available and more public. So yeah, if people have ideas about that, I'm very interested to hear them. On the first question, the question about variable IDs, I mean, there's nothing that prevents you still from just searching up all the variable IDs and finding things. It's more just that I think for the majority of people, most of the time, you're going to be able to find the data you need much more quicker. That said, if you wanted to still do a fully exhaustive search, yes, you're right. You would have to go through and search all the variable IDs you wanted properly.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. I see Tim came on camera. Do you have anything you want to add before we move on?
No, I think yeah, that was very well answered. Thanks, Robin.
Great. We have some questions and comments in the chat, and so I would encourage everyone to move that to the Padlet, and so we can have follow-up. And since we need to move on to our final project presentation by Monica Morrison on responsible use of CMIP data. Monica, are you there?
I'm here. Sorry, my computer's acting a bit slow. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can, but not in presentation mode.
Okay,
yet.
perfect. Is that better?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm just going to give an overview of one of the projects that we're referring to as responsible use of CMIP data. Give an account of kind of what we're trying to get at, the motivation for having this project, as well as how things are currently going and what next steps are. So this kind of came out of a recognition of a certain challenge that GCMs or Earth system models are not always fit or adequate for certain purposes. And so when you're using the data from these models or from these experiments for the purposes of informing actionable research or actionable science, which is adaptation management, resilience decisions, basically decision making, there's a risk in using something that might not give you the information that you need. And CMIP models aren't appropriate for some adaptation management and resilience decisions. And so CMIP can just kind of maybe take on the role of communicating about the various sorts of inadequacies or limitations of these models that might make them unfit or inadequate for certain purposes. And so this project is really thinking about how do we inform users about how to responsibly use data from CMIP experiments, and ultimately how do we increase literacy around the data that CMIP is providing with respect to different sorts of applications. So some examples of the things that we're concerned with that need to be communicated, because there is risk in using models that have these sorts of attributes for certain purposes, is how there's certain representational deficits or simplified representations that render the model unable to represent processes or dynamics that matter for understanding certain impacts. So an example of that is a 3D representation of lakes. I think up until CMIP 6, about a third to half of models had, according to a study done by Briley et al. In 2021, had insufficient representation of lakes because they didn't have 3D representation, which meant they were incapable of capturing the lake, air, land processes that matter and actually drive local climate impacts in regions where there are large lakes like the Laurentian Great Lakes here in Michigan, Minnesota, etc. We also have various sorts of things due to simplifications or compensating errors, like physically unrealistic representations of runoff sensitivities. So some models have represented an increase in runoff with an increase in temperature, which is to some extent inconsistent in many regions with what we know to be theoretically accurate. There's also things related to some of these biases that were talked about in one of the earlier project presentations, where we are seeing that in terms of how our models represent trends, especially humidity trends in arid regions, that there's inconsistency with how the model is evolving under new conditions and what we're actually seeing in how things are trending in observations. Another one that's a bias is the equatorial Pacific evolving into more El Nino-like state, which can lead to a misrepresentation of changes in tropical cyclone activity in the North Atlantic. There's also things that are entirely missing, like the increase in summer Greenland blocking. And then there's simplifications and idealizations and things like our representation of soil structure, and in some models, like just overall omissions of representation of certain things that matter for certain applications with respect to how we represent soil structure and soil properties. And so what we're really trying to understand is kind of, well, what are these representational gaps that are a consequence of how these models have been developed in order to provide us with information about global emergent properties? And if people are using the models to understand regional things and then understand regional impacts specifically in reference to actionable applications, what are things that they need to be aware of in terms of the way these models are constructed and the implications of that construction for being able to answer different questions? And so this kind of started out with a white paper that was presented to CMIP over a year ago at this point. We did get the okay from the CMIP panel to go forward with this, and actually we're going forward with it as a co-led task team with Fresh Eyes on CMIP representing one half of the task team, and then the Regional Information for Society, which is a WCRP program, having the other side of the task team. And the aims of objectives of this are to understand various uses of CMIP data, and to disseminate and design guidance on the appropriate uses and limitations of data so that we can increase data literacy around CMIP data from experiments, to cut down on potential misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and misapplications of the data, or at least give some sort of guidance on, well, when you're using this output, you need to be aware of these sorts of limitations in its use, or even just flagging certain output fields like runoff sensitivities to say that this is not fit for use in any sort of actionable application. So another thing around this is that this is kind of consistent with thinking about FAIR principles and advancing various sorts of open source data or open science standards within the context of CMIP, where we'll increase transparency around the models and the model development processes as well as their usage. Okay, so potential outputs, and this is something that as we progress in our conversations and the development of an actual agenda with the Regional Information for Society, half of the task team will consider and delegate to either the Fresh Eyes portion or the RIFs portion, or as something that's to be jointly done. But one idea is to add some sort of additional descriptive metadata that provides simple information or flags on output fields that we know have gross errors or inadequacies. An example here being that runoff output field. Defining what constitutes misuse and providing fact sheets on how to address and avoid instances of misuse. Create and disseminate case studies of the appropriate uses of CMIP data, especially output fields that might be a bit more difficult to use because there are sorts of biases or potential simplifications in how the model represents processes that are then used to calculate that output. Advising on best practices to avoid falling into common traps that are associated with misuse of data. Providing systematic reports on potential inadequacies, like when models don't have 3D representation of lakes, and then trying to help people understand what the implications of those simplifications in the model might be for using information on that region, or that relates to those kind of representational simplifications. And then potentially thinking about how eventually this might feed into having certain changes in how we document our model procedures to include some sort of recognition of caveats in individual models based on their development histories and trajectories, and the decisions that were made about how to develop them and why you're developing them in that way. So next steps, we're actually scheduling the first meeting for the co-led task team, where we'll bring together individuals who have signed up on the Fresh Eyes for CMIP side to be a part of this responsible use project, as well as people from the Regional Information for Society side. We'll develop various sorts of proposals or projects for proof of concept. Some of the things that we've determined are low-hanging fruit on the Fresh Eyes side are working to develop documents or fact sheets on these inadequacies, as well as thinking about developing some sort of short list of considerations that people need to dive into, or guidelines for questions that you need to answer about the model or the models prior to using the output data. And we see these as kind of means for increasing data literacy around CMIP, and need to think about how to best disseminate and communicate those sorts of things. But that'll be part of the co-led project. Okay. So hopefully, have I stopped sharing?
Thanks,
right.
Monica.
Perfect. Yes. Thanks for the opportunity.
Right. I see Tim has a hand raised and then lowered. Oh, you just want to give a clap, so thanks. And I think Tim now is also working for RIFT, so he will probably be in touch with you as well. And to see if there's any other questions, Monica, for Monica on the responsible use of CMIP data project. Yes, Brian.
Hi, Monica. Really interesting work, and it's thank you for the presentation and the update. It's brilliant to see this group and the outputs that you're looking to deliver. My question, I guess, relates to the work we're doing with the rapid evaluation framework. We're really keen to make sure that we're not only inclusive, but the way that it is developed, structured, and the ongoing sort of development and the governance of it works to the principles that you just set out, but also that there is responsible use of the outputs with some very specific ambitions by the model benchmarking task team around that. So I just wondered, appreciate you've got a lot on your plate already, but what might be the best way perhaps to do that? And I just wondered if there's kind of perhaps something, instead of asking your group to do yet more work, if there's something like some principles you're going to be developing or something that we could then articulate and use within the REF perhaps.
Yeah, that's a great question. And right now, this has actually been a bit of a slow spin up, right? And I think it's Forrest Hoffman, if I'm not mistaken, who's one of the leads of that rapid evaluation framework development. And so I've seen him at like AGU, and we've both been told to talk to one another to see where there might be some sort of potential synergy. And that's just kind of unfortunately been put on the back burner. But that's definitely something that as we actually start to gain momentum, we can begin talking with them. Because I do think for some of the things that we want to produce, like the best practices, right, or the guidelines or list of considerations that people need to reflect on when they're looking to use data, that those might be easily transferable, right, to some of this evaluation framework work, as well as the outputs that are being generated from those sort of diagnostic tests. So yeah, I think kind of there's definitely synergy there, and we just need to, I think, in maybe the next couple of weeks, set up a point for the co-leads of the task team, so myself and Louis Philippe from RIFs, to maybe coordinate with Forrest and the other people working there to figure out, is there some sort of low-hanging fruit on our plate that we can maybe try to co-develop so that there is transferability to that rapid evaluation work.
We'll take an action to invite you to the next task team meeting, because this is a really important topic, and then maybe that can then open up the opportunities to take further. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be fabulous. I would really appreciate that. I think that's the best way to start the conversation and actually get moving on something that we can collaborate on.
Excellent. Thank you, Monica. And we are right on time. And thanks for all the 4 project presenters here. And the recording will be available to people who are not here to watch. And also questions can still be submitted to the Padlet, and so we can have follow-ups. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth, who is going to